I'm Jean Gray, founder and publisher of American Entrepreneurship Today, a website that brings news and valuable information to entrepreneurs, innovators, and investors all across America. Our podcast series, Experienced Voices, explores the journeys of very successful people in the entrepreneurial arena who are open to sharing the key elements that led to their great success.
Our guest today on Experienced Voices is Robyn Barrett, Senior Vice President at Oxford Commercial Finance, that now owns the factoring company Robyn started, FSW. In our discussion, Robyn provides an overview of factoring, an important financial vehicle that supports the working capital of high-growth businesses. As an entrepreneur herself, she also offers insight on the challenges she faced in starting, growing, and then selling her business. Robyn, thank you for being a guest on Experienced Voices. I have had some background in banking and finance, and I know factoring is a big challenge for entrepreneurs to understand who do not have a finance background. So let's start our discussion by you explaining really what is factoring.
Great. Thank you for having me on also. It's always a great opportunity to talk to entrepreneurs who I love, right? They're the backbone of America. So factoring is the oldest form of finance, which is funny because it's also, I think, the most misunderstood form of finance. It was primarily in the garment industry, and it was non-recourse, which we'll talk about later, versus recourse. But in a nutshell, for an entrepreneur, you finance your business with your credit card, your friends and family, and then you get to a point where you get a large invoice, let's say from like Costco. Costco says, we would love to have all of your products in all of our DCs, our distribution centers. And the entrepreneur has a panic at that moment, thinking, I don't want to say no to Costco because I may never get the chance again. I got to figure this out. So the first thing they're going to do is, because people don't know, entrepreneurs really don't understand what their options are for financing. They'll call their bank, they'll call their CPA, and the banks and the CPAs are going to say, well, we can't help you, but we know of an alternative lender that we think that can. 99% of my calls that come in from entrepreneurs is because they've been said no to several times. They're frustrated. They want to get this order. And so factoring is the ability for an entrepreneur in a fast-growing company to leverage their accounts receivable. They sell their accounts receivable to the factor. So it's different from a bank. A bank offers a line of credit, which is a cash flow loan. Most entrepreneurs don't have cash flow or not the cash flow needed by the bank. So factoring really is that step for entrepreneurs that after they've put their credit cards on the line, they put their personal savings on the line, they've asked all their friends and family to come in and put equity in, then factors are the next level to get the financing so the company and the entrepreneur can grow. And the great thing about factoring is that it's based on their sales. So the more the entrepreneur can sell, the more the factor can finance their working capital. So it's a pretty good marriage.
So when I'm selling or my sales team or selling and bringing in a lot of revenue, which creates the accounts receivable, I offer terms. And we know that sometimes, as you mentioned with Costco, is that even though we say it's net 30 or net 45, there are situations where a growing company has clients or customers who are stretching out from 30 to 60, 90 days. And that directly impacts what we call working capital, which is the flow of cash in a company to keep it moving. So will factoring eliminate that void of me not being able to get my money fast enough from a customer, but I'll get it sooner through the factor?
You are correct. Really what factoring does is it reduces that conversion of accounts receivable to cash. You can have an entrepreneur that is rich in terms of assets, accounts receivable, yet they have no money in the bank. And if you think of, let's say, we'll use the Costco example, and let's say they're net 60 days. If they're net 60 days from the date that so first of all, it's a date they received that invoice. So that invoice could have been sent 7 days beforehand. But that window of 60 or 70 days, the entrepreneur has to figure out, okay, so how do I pay my supplier? Oh, and I've got payroll every week, but I'm rich in assets, but I have no cash in the bank. So once that entrepreneur is able to supply Costco with that invoice, a factor can fund against that invoice, and the advance rates are anywhere from 80 to 90%. That gives that entrepreneur cash today that they can pay their critical vendors and they can pay their employees. So think of factoring as it's evening out my cash flow. I'm going to have ups and downs on my cash flow, and entrepreneurs panic, right? Because finance isn't their first love. Selling their brand, their product, that's their first love. Cash flow is difficult for an entrepreneur because you have to sit there and wait by the mailbox for your client to send you the money. And then you have to figure out how am I going to allocate that money? And you certainly can't tell your employees, I can't pay you for the next 60 days. So factoring, again, kind of fills that gap. And you are absolutely correct. It just shortens that conversion of accounts receivable to cash.
So this would be a good point to explain recourse versus non-recourse, because that changes the narrative. Explain a little bit about the risk and where a factor uses recourse or non-recourse.
Correct. Non-recourse is primarily in the garment or apparel industry. It's been non-recourse in that industry since, I think, the dawn of time. Non-recourse is also traditionally what factoring was, right? That was the factoring of, my grandparents. But the factoring has evolved. And again, I think the non-recourse factoring also is what people are used to. And they think of it as, the 500-pound gorilla that's calling their customers and demanding, when is payment coming in? When is payment coming in? The reason being is non-recourse versus recourse really comes down to one thing: shifting of the credit risk. With non-recourse, the factor takes the credit risk, and their biggest goal is to collect that receivable. One, to reduce credit risk, and also it increases their yield. On a recourse factor, we're traditionally like a bank line of a credit. So the credit risk has stayed with the borrower. The borrower is responsible if that invoice goes to 90 days. If that invoice is not good, then the borrower has to purchase that invoice back. And there's several ways that we work with our borrowers to buy back that invoice. Because as we talked about, the whole idea of using factoring is to have cash flow. And if I have a client that has a 90-day invoice and I'm like, well, you have to buy this invoice back today, and they're telling me, well, I'm not going to make payroll, I can't pay my vendor, then the idea is the factor has to work with the borrower. Like, it's a long-term and it's a relationship. How can I help my borrower every day? Factoring is very customer service oriented, and the factor is talking to their customers all the time because our customers need the cash flow. So then getting back to the non-recourse versus recourse, non-recourse, the entrepreneur shifts the credit risk to the factor. What's the downside? You're going to pay a lot more for non-recourse. But it works really well if you're in the apparel industry. So it's industry specific. Then on the recourse is really, I would say, where most of factoring is these days. The credit risk still lies with the customer. The factor does do credit research, which assists the customer or the entrepreneur. And the pricing is a lot less because the factor isn't carrying the full amount of credit risk of the invoice.
Does the factor take all of my receivables, or do you cherry pick them?
That is a great question. And again, factoring has evolved a lot. It's had to. So there are some clients, we have clients that are like, hey, you know what? I don't want to factor all of my AR. I only want to factor my accounts receivable that maybe has terms of net 60 days. And that makes sense. If you've got customers that are paying COD or customers that are paying within 7 days, that's really not, it's not worth it for an entrepreneur to factor that. So factoring has become very flexible. And a lot of it is the conversation between the factor and the entrepreneur to see what product works well for that entrepreneur. There are some entrepreneurs or some companies that say, I want to run all of my accounts receivable through the factor. I want to have the most availability possible. And again, then there's other entrepreneurs who say, look, I only need help with a couple debtors. And real quick, the debtors are the entrepreneur's customers.
So I'm a stressed out entrepreneur and I am finally getting customers in, but it's a slow go. So what's the dollar amount when I should be contacting a factor? Is it 50,000, 150,000, 500,000? When does the relationship make sense practically for a factor to work with a company?
It's not a dollar limit. It's actually what's coming down the pipeline for that entrepreneur. So let's say we have an entrepreneur who has developed a functional energy drink, and they've launched the functional energy drink. They don't have any AR right now, and they probably have maybe they've even lost money. But the issue is they know they have contracts in hand, they have purchase orders in hand that tell them that they are going to have sales of $300,000 or $800,000 or even $1 million within the month. So it's not a dollar amount. It's really the entrepreneur has to understand and say, let me look and see what's coming down my pipeline. Let me make the call to the factor. Let me get everything set up in place. So when those accounts receivable hit, I'm ready to go. My factor is set up and able to fund me on day one. If entrepreneurs wait, that's where the problem comes, and they become very stressed out because they come when they need the money and the air is already out there. The factor does have to underwrite the transaction. That takes a little bit of time, and that's what causes the stress. So for entrepreneurs, look down the pipeline. If you see and you've got orders and you can kind of look out and just guess what your accounts receivable are going to be in the next 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, that's going to tell you when it's time to pick up the phone.
So I have the purchase order and it's from a large company, which someone like Costco or, Boeing, these are large companies that have great credit ratings. So I have the purchase order, but the invoice may not be close to maybe 30 or 60 days out, as you were saying. So can I come to you as the entrepreneur and say, hey, look, I have a $500,000 purchase order from Boeing, and I need some money in advance of even us getting that product over to Boeing. Is that possible?
So that is possible. And I work a lot with entrepreneurs because a lot of times entrepreneurs don't actually know what they need. Maybe they've been told, oh, you've got a large purchase order. You need to talk to a factor. Purchase order financing and factoring are drastically different, but work super well together. So for example, let's say you come to me and you've got $1 million purchase order from Boeing, and you need to buy $600,000 worth of goods, or maybe you have a co-manufacturer that's making the product, but you have to put the money down first. Purchase order lenders understand that risk. That's production risk. I do credit risk, which is accounts receivable, 2 different products. So when an entrepreneur calls me up, again, I'm not going to say no. My goal is when I've got somebody on the phone, I want to understand what their problem is. I want to be able to tell them either I can help you, or you know what, I'm going to send you some names of some other people. So if you come to me with a large purchase order, I'm going to put you in touch with purchase order lenders that we have worked with. And the purchase order lender then will come in. They will fund the cost of goods. They won't fund the entire purchase order. And that's a misconception that people don't understand. The purchase order lender is going to come in and make sure that you have the funds, and they'll send the funds directly to the vendors so that you have the funds to produce the goods. Once the goods are produced, the AR lender or the factor would come in, advance on the invoice at that point, pay off the PO lender, and the remaining amount of the advance goes to the borrower.
Well, that's a lot for a first-time entrepreneur, even someone who knows finance, to understand. And I think you really explained well that this is a sort of like a ladder that an entrepreneur goes up. As the company grows, they become have opportunity or avenues into more sophisticated funding and finance. And they've got to, put in the homework to understand the opportunity of where to get money when they're growing. So we'll stick with factoring, but it was really great you explained purchase order financing. Is there any circumstance when I'm working with a factor that you might ask for a personal guarantee?
So personal guarantees are something a factor loves to have, and there's something that the borrower hates to give. So there's that fine line. So there are options. So I would say if the entrepreneur owns a majority of the company and it's a startup, they're going to have to give a personal guarantee. And in my discussion with entrepreneurs, when they push back on that, is I'm like, if I'm willing to take the risk on the company, I want to make sure you're willing to take the risk on your company. And I want to make sure, if nothing else on that personal guarantee, if the deal goes sideways, you're going to be standing right next to me trying to make that right. Now, if the company or the entrepreneur, the new growing company is widely held in terms of ownership, getting a personal guarantee is really impossible. In that case, we can do what's called a validity guarantee. And the validity guarantee basically guarantees the factor that, invoices are accurate, they're not fraudulent, and that, if they are fraudulent, then it does become a personal guarantee. Usually that would be signed by a controller or the CFO of a company. So there are options, but I will tell entrepreneurs, if you are the sole owner, you own more than 50%, then don't be surprised if you're asked to do a personal guarantee. Now, the more the company grows and the more cash flow that drops to the bottom line, that's where entrepreneurs need to be proactive. And if they're changing their business relationship or lending relationship to a bank, then I would say I would negotiate that personal guarantee to either be limited or a validity guarantee.
In the first few years of a startup, the preparation of financials is usually the last thing that an entrepreneur goes to. And I think from experience in certain industries, especially in companies that have, eventually become unicorns, high growth can go very quickly. So how do you deal with financials if a company is 2 years old and is already hitting $25 or $50 million and it's going even faster? Because you got the VCs in there, you got the angels in there. Is there a half step with a factor in those type of circumstances? And especially, what is your expectation about them giving you valid or the appropriate level of financial information?
Good question. So there's a lot of different levels in terms of financial reporting that a factor can accept. On smaller deals, I don't expect that my borrowers are going to be able to give me financial statements that I could use. They just aren't. They're either doing them on QuickBooks, their accountant may look at them once a month, every 6 months. Maybe sometimes I have clients that their CPA doesn't look at the books until the end of the year when they do a tax return. So it's all relative to risk. When you're talking though about a company that now is doing $20 to $25 million of sales, I would expect that they have monthly internal financials. I would expect that they have a reviewed or an audited annual report from a CPA. So the more you're selling, the more you're growing, you get to different levels where the borrower or the bank or the lender is going to require more sophisticated financial reporting. Honestly, for most of our entrepreneurs and our factoring clients, we don't look at the financials. We're really looking at the accounts receivable and the credit quality of the customers behind those accounts receivable. So for entrepreneurs, I would say it's very wise to get a very good bookkeeper or CPA. That will make a big difference, that as you grow, you're not working backwards and trying to get your books in order.
Is there a difference in interest rate between a bank and a factor? And should a company meet with more than one factor to make a judgment who is the best factor to use?
Yes. And I think a takeaway is for entrepreneurs is pick your lender, pick your factor wisely. Getting out of a loan or a factoring agreement is probably more difficult than divorcing. So think of it and do it wisely. So know your factors. So I would suggest to entrepreneurs or anyone out there that's looking for a lender, talk to a couple different factors, talk to a couple different banks if that's where you're at. First of all, you want to make sure that the lender or the factor you're dealing with can talk to you and can explain to you the process and that you feel comfortable with. Why would you want to work with a factor that can't answer your questions or is like, I'm too busy to deal with you? You don't want that. You want to have a factor that you feel that you'll have a good relationship with. So I think that's really important. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs rush into a lending relationship and then later figure out this isn't working for me, but boy, I don't know how I'm going to get out of it. So that's really important. So I do think it's important that you interview people to work for you, right? And if you're interviewing people to work for you, you should be interviewing your lender.
Are there any circumstances, since you've had such a long career and broad career as a factor, of what it might be considered a deal killer, where it looks good, it sounds good, but there's certain things that over time you have learned pop up that you say as a factor, this isn't a good deal?
So there are deals. So deal killers across the board are going to be the obvious. Have you murdered somebody? Did you have wire fraud? Those are pretty much deal killers. So you've got the personality issues or, those, they have the 5 C's of credit. So it's like, who is that person? So, right. So if they can't pass that, it's a deal killer. There's also factors will specialize in specific niches and specific industries. So for example, construction, garment, healthcare, those are all really specialized industries. And there's factors and lenders that specialize just in lending to those industries. But deal killers, if you've got a typical factoring deal, if you've got good accounts receivable, and your debtor or your debtors/customers are credit worthy, there shouldn't be a reason that a factor can't do business with you. Again, unless you've got something in your personal past that has caused issues that nobody wants to touch you.
So you made a good point about the credit worthiness of the companies who are generating the accounts receivable. So you come in as a factor and you do a profile of our receivable base and making some judgment that we have an extended terms to companies that you later find out are poor credit risks. Is that one of the very first steps that you take in the relationship?
Yes. Once I talk to somebody on the phone, let's say it's the initial call, I tell them, send me your accounts receivable aging, your current one right now. And I'll quickly tell you what terms I can do and what debtors we can or can't do. I think what's really good for entrepreneurs is to know that factors can really help with some of their back office. Again, entrepreneurs are focused forward, right? Customer facing, but the factors are experts at credit, right? So when a client sends me an accounts receivable aging, I'm going to look at it. I'm going to look to see who are your customers? Are they credit worthy? And how are they paying? We can also, factors can pull credit reports. So I may have a borrower who comes to me and says, hey, you know what? I'm going to sell to ABC company. And they said, that I can have 30-day terms if I gave them a cheaper price. So I'll pull the credit on ABC company and I'll say, hey, I think that's great that they're going to pay you in 30 days. I can tell you right now, they're not paying any of their vendors in less than 60 days. So that helps the client also. So to say, okay, well, should I negotiate the pricing differently? That's your choice. But I'm just telling you that the ABC company is not paying anyone in 30 days. So think about, it's a good thing for the client to know when they're out there negotiating. On an ongoing basis, the factor is watching the credit of all of the customers that make up that AR. And that helps the entrepreneur. It helps the entrepreneur to say, okay, if I have a $100,000 limit with ABC company, and now I want to sell $500,000, let me check with my factor to see if they'll raise the credit limit. And if the factor is not going to raise a credit limit, the factor is going to tell you why, which is really good intel for the borrower to make a decision. Okay, if my factor is not going to extend that much credit, do I want to?
Exactly, is that entrepreneurs for the first time, they do not have the experience of understanding how to set credit terms. And so that is one of the earliest areas of risk for an entrepreneur, is overextending and feeling things can be done sort of based upon a friendly relationship that turns out to work against them. So I guess we could segue over to, you ended up building your own factoring company. You are actually an entrepreneur, and you then established a financing company that specifically works for entrepreneurs. So I guess most people would say, well, what were you thinking? But what were the circumstances, Robyn, in which you were gaining a lot of experience, and then you said, I have the wherewithal to do this? So how did your thinking come about?
So I think every entrepreneur will tell you, and I will tell you this too, ignorance is bliss, right? You have an idea, you do it, and you're all excited. And then, there's roadblocks that come up. And, that's what makes entrepreneurs great, because we get in it, we have a dream, we have a purpose on that dream, and we're not going to stop, and we're not going to let roadblocks stop us. My background, I'm a CPA, and I worked as a financial analyst for a large consumer product group. And I noticed that I was going to be pigeonholed in accounting forever. It's like accounting hell. And the only way that I could get out of that was to find a company that could understand my qualities and take my accounting background, but also let me be customer forward facing. And so I worked for a large commercial finance company, which is bankrupt now. And I worked for them for 5 years, and I got a great management training. I started out in accounting. I went into budgeting. Then I went into underwriting and into credit and then into sales. So it really helped me get that first experience of, what do factors do? And when the company went bankrupt, I looked around and I said, well, I can go work for a bank, or maybe I'll just take a shot and try and do this myself, which was pretty bold because there were really no women in commercial finance when I started my company. I was like the misfit toy in the box. And so it was more difficult. But again, entrepreneurs get this, man. You put your head down and you just go. You don't take no for an answer. If there's an obstacle, you find a solution and you just keep going. And that's what I did.
There are a lot of different ways for companies to start up. And one of the best one is if you have already some target customers in your pocket. Those who leave an experience but don't leave with enough contacts in the industry to develop future business, they're facing a really steep hill to climb. So when you left your other company to start your own company, did you set it up in a way where you knew how to do business development and to land some of those early customers?
Not a clue. Not a clue.
So how did that go?
Well, again, it's trial and error. So I will tell you though, my experience and my contacts through corporate America and then working for a large commercial finance company, those people that I knew and I met along the way helped me tremendously when I started my company. If I had a problem, I was like, how can I work this out? I knew I always had people I could call that could help me. That was really valuable. So I think that's really important for entrepreneurs to be able to have people to call when they have an issue. They're not there by themselves. So in terms of, marketing, again, I just had to figure it out. And ironically, I know you're not going to believe this, but I truly am an introvert and I had to learn how to be an extrovert. So I had to learn to be that person to go into a full room full of people and go up and just shake their hand. Hi, I'm Robyn Barrett. What do you do? My very first deal actually came, this will probably age me, but it came from a postcard mailing. If it was the first deal I got and it was like $250,000, I was so panicked. I was like, how am I going to do this? And again, this is what entrepreneurs have to face. How am I going to do this? We figure it out because we're different.
Did you then, having your first customer and knowing finance, you had to know how to advance those funds to fill your own gap? So was a bank relationship foundational, or you were at that point using enough of your personal funds to weigh through that first year or two?
So I used personal funds and I had a small line of credit with the bank. I was lucky. I grew my company conservatively. I didn't take on more than I could do. So as I grew, I was able to keep money in my company. I was cash flow positive. I was dropping money to the bottom line, and I was lucky that I was able to have a bank facility as to leverage the entire time that I owned my company. And that doesn't happen a lot. I mean, so it helped me, so I could offer like cheaper costs to my clients. But, I think that's the hardest part is kind of getting that first, how do you get from point A to point B, that seed money? And so I was like we talked, I mean, I had that seed money, but after I exhausted that seed money, I knew that I had to go out and find a lender. So there's always lots of options.
So I understand that you sold your company. So as we kind of wrap up our discussion today, what was your thinking about being an entrepreneur and then making the decision to exit?
So I started my company, right, in 2001. I had it for 21 years. I owned it myself and I didn't have a partner. So when I look down and I'm 59 now, when I look down the road of where do I want to be in 5 years or 10 years, I didn't have an exit strategy. So 5 years ago, I sat down and thought, if I want to sell my company, I want to keep my team together and I want to get the highest price possible. What do I need to do? So I knew that I had to strengthen my management team. I had to put policies and procedures in place. I had to do things to make myself attractive to a bank that would want to acquire me, and not just my assets, but, acquire my company and keep my team together. So why did I do it? I did it because I didn't have somebody to take over my company.
So looking back, this is truly my last question, is would you do it again, or would you do something differently now that you have the wisdom of experience that you could have bypassed an ache or a pain or a challenge if you had more wisdom at the time? Any one area of heartache, or you look back and you just simply said, I took on the challenge and it was worth it?
It is extremely stressful to be an entrepreneur. You are responsible for employees and their paychecks. You have your own money on the line. There is not a thing that I would have changed. And I made mistakes. But on each mistake that I made, I learned, and it made me a better lender. So, and I'm also, I guess, a glutton for punishment. So would I do it again? Sure. And looking back, would I have done it? Ignorance is bliss. Sure, I would have done it. I have worked with amazing entrepreneurs, amazing companies, and I've been able to help those companies go from, hey, here's where we are, to, now we're super successful. We're going to a bank. Maybe, we're going to sell the company. So I really enjoy that part, that customer forward facing, learning about new businesses, meeting new people, and I love the passion.
Well, Robyn, thank you for being a guest on Experience Voices and sharing your career and your knowledge about factoring. That's been such an important vehicle for entrepreneurs over the ages to grow their companies. So again, thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the podcast series Experience Voices, hosted by Jean Grey, publisher of American Entrepreneurship Today. Sign up for the series at AmericanEntrepreneurship.com/podcasts.